I thought about a million different ways to start this talk. And last night when I got home, I decided that I wasn't going to go with any of those million ways I had thought of. Instead, I wanted to start with why it was I felt like I needed to come up with a million different ways to start this talk. And the reason is mainly that I'm pretty anxious about this talk. And I'm anxious about this talk for two different reasons. I'm anxious in part because the things I'm going to be talking about today are unbelievably dear to me. I think these things are extremely important, and I want to convince you that these things are important as well. And in large part, what I'm going to be talking about today is social justice. And we are a public social institution. And it seems to me that it should be an essential goal of any public social institution to be seriously contributing to social justice. And I want to give some ways in which I think that can be done. So I just don't want to mess up there. That's one reason I'm particularly anxious. But I'm also anxious because I am a white male. And I think white people in America intuitively recognize that the white supremacist system we have grown up in has not taught us to be racially literate, has not given us the tools, has not made us have the tools to be able to talk about race and racial issues in particularly comfortable ways. And one of the things I'm going to be encouraging white faculty and staff to be doing is to work through this discomfort. And so I wanted it to be clear that this is something I'm working on as well. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to start here. But that really gets at goal number 2 of my talk for today. So I should bring us back to the beginning. So Karen said I'm going to be talking about Black Lives Matter as a slogan versus All Lives Matter as a slogan. And my thesis with respect to these is simply going to be that trying to replace or even respond to someone saying Black Lives Matter with someone saying All Lives Matter is mistaken and misdirected. We should be very happily following along with the Black Lives Matter movement, and in particular, we should be very happy with Black Lives Matter as a slogan. And I differentiate between Black Lives Matter as a movement and Black Lives Matter as a slogan, in part because some of my goals for today. So in a certain sense, I'm just going to be assuming that the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement are ones that we should have. I don't find the goals of the Black Lives Matter movement to really be anything controversial. They seem to me obviously goals that people should have. So in some ways, what I'm going to be talking about is whether or not Black Lives Matter as a slogan or All Lives Matter as a slogan is better for these goals of the Black Lives Matter movement. So, and again, I'm going to be arguing for this thesis, and this is going to be coming from my training in philosophy of language and linguistics. And my second goal here, as I've pointed out, is I want to gesture at why I think this thesis suggests that we shouldn't expect or even be looking for something like an algorithm for being anti-racist. And I need to give a little background for this particular goal here. So one of the things I do on campus here is I co-chair with Jennifer Mitchell this group POP. Are people aware of the POP group on campus? So POP is an acronym for our group Preparing and Organizing for Change, Teaching, Learning, and Practicing Racial Justice at SUNY Potsdam. So we have gotten a grant through the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at SUNY Central to work on some anti-racism training for faculty and staff here. And throughout this work we've been doing this year, we've had some great things happen, but there's been one particular thing I've heard from a lot of the members working in this that I want to try to curb this desire that people have. So I've heard from a lot of people that they want something like a checklist, a list of do's and don'ts, a simple toolkit for being anti-racist in any situation whatsoever. And I simply do not think that this is the way we ought to be thinking about anti-racism work. I don't think we should be looking for something like a toolkit, a checklist, a list of do's and don'ts, that if you just mindlessly follow this thing, you will ipso facto be anti-racist. So I've sort of summed this up as we shouldn't be looking for an algorithm that will help us be anti-racist. So this is another one of my goals today, to try to justify why it is I've claimed to people that we shouldn't be expecting such an algorithm to be forthcoming. And finally, my last goal here is to use my first two goals as a way to exemplify what I've referred to elsewhere as bringing the relevant realities of social oppression into a course while still teaching very much within our expertise. So I wrote a piece last semester as part of my work with POP, trying to encourage faculty and staff members to bring issues of social oppression into their day-to-day work lives. So I'm going to try to show you some of the ways in which I've done this while still sticking within my expertise. So the reason I talk about sticking within my expertise is because a number of people have said to me they would absolutely love to talk about these things. They think it's an important thing to talk about, but they say, I'm not an expert in social justice. I'm an expert in something else. So I want to show you some ways here in which I think we can stick squarely within our expertise and still be talking about these issues of social justice and social oppression. So those are my basic goals for today. And again, I'm going to be trying to get at these goals by talking about this controversy over whether or not Black Lives Matter is an appropriate slogan for social justice goals, or whether or not All Lives Matter is an appropriate slogan for certain social justice goals. And I'm going to be using, as I said, some canonical work from the philosophy of language and linguistics to try to do this, but the basic idea behind what I'm trying to say can be put rather simply. And it was once put to me rather brilliantly by Dr. Youngblood when he said, saying white lives matter in response to Black lives matter is like saying, why aren't we talking about lupus when we're at a breast cancer rally? It's not that we don't care about lupus. That's not what we're talking about at a breast cancer rally. That's not what the point is. That's not what the relevant background is. And this basic point has been put some other ways that I really like. Another one was, if there's a subdivision and a house is on fire, the fire department wouldn't show up and put water on all the houses because all houses matter. They would show up and turn on their water on the house that was burning because that's the house that needs help the most. And I think maybe sort of the simplest way to put my point, it was put to me this way by one of my students. My student said, responding to Black Lives Matter by saying all lives matter is assuming that what we mean by Black Lives Matter is that only Black lives matter. But that is not the way at all I think we should take the Black Lives Matter slogan. It's not that we're saying only Black lives matter. It's that we're saying Black lives matter too. Black lives matter also. So that's more or less the gist of what I'm going to be saying, but I'm going to be complicating this with some pretentious philosophy of language, because that's what philosophers do. They try to take simple ideas and make them as complicated and pretentious as possible. So the work I'm going to be building off of is the work of a very, very famous philosopher by the name of Paul Grice. So Paul Grice lived throughout most of the 20th century. I've got his dates there. He lived 1913 to 1988. And he was an Oxford-trained philosopher and spent the beginning of his career at Oxford before moving to Cal Berkeley in the 60s. And it was when he first moved to the United States that he gave the William James lectures, in which his most famous idea came out, which is his logic of conversation thesis. And the basic idea behind the logic of conversation thesis is that lots and lots of times when we're talking to people, we communicate a whole hell of a lot more than what is literally meant by the words we've used. So if I say to you something like, "Boy, it's really, really cold in here," and I'm at your house, I'm not just saying something about the temperature in the house. I'm asking you to turn the heat up, or I'm asking you to close a window. That is, I'm communicating a lot more than what was meant by the words that was literally meant by the words I said. So Grice's basic thesis here, his logic of conversation, is that this does not happen sort of haphazardly. There's an underlying implied system that we use to infer what the speaker has intended to communicate from the direct and literal meaning of that which the speaker said. So this is the basic idea behind the logic of conversation thesis, that there's often a difference between what the words we use mean and what we intend to communicate by using those words, and that there is a somewhat rigorous system that we use to figure out what was intended to be communicated. And the basic principle of this system is called the cooperative principle. So the basic idea behind this logic of conversation is that we assume that the people we're talking with are trying to be cooperative with us, that we're in a cooperative venture here, we're trying to get some things done, and what it is we're trying to get done will dictate some of what we're communicating to each other. So this is an unbelievably general principle. So Grice nicely broke this principle down into some further conversational maxims that he thinks we assume speakers we're engaged with are following, and we use that assumption to help figure out, again, what was intended to be communicated from the literal meaning of the words used. And these are broken down into 4 different types of maxims: the maxims of quantity, the maxims of quality, the maxim of relevance, and a number of maxims of manner. And the basic maxims of quantity are that when we're engaged in a conversation, we should only give as much information as required for the purposes of that conversation. We shouldn't give too much information. We shouldn't give not enough information. It's the basic idea behind the maxims of quantity. And the maxims of quality: we shouldn't say things we think are false. We shouldn't say things that we think we don't have evidence for. So speakers that we're having conversations with can use the maxims of quality to assume that when I say something in a conversation, it's because I believe it's true, and it's because I believe I have adequate evidence for believing that it's true. Maxim of relevance is really beautiful. Basically, be relevant. Don't just say completely random things in a conversation. Be relevant to what the purpose of the conversation is. Philosophers love to stay really general. I hate this about philosophers. So let's take a particular example here of how these maxims work in practice. So I live in town on Cherry Street, and I'm imagining here that one day somebody comes up to my house, and I see that their car has died, and they come up to my house and they say to me, "I'm out of gas." And I respond to them, "Well, there's a garage on the corner of Market Street and Cherry Street." Now, I haven't said anything about gasoline. I haven't directly said a word about gasoline. But it seems pretty clear that when I say there's a garage on the corner of Market Street and Cherry Street, I'm communicating to the original speaker that you can get some gasoline at that garage on the corner of Market Street and Cherry Street. But notice, nothing about the literal meaning of this sentence has anything to do with gasoline. So the point here is that this is one of these cases where we're using the logic of conversation to figure out what the speaker has intended to communicate above and beyond what the literal meaning of the words was. And in particular, what we're doing is we're using the maxim of relevance. So the maxim of relevance tells us that we are only to say things that are relevant to the conversational context. So if I've said that there's a garage on the corner of Market Street and Cherry Street after somebody has told me they're out of gas, the maxim of relevance dictates that the speaker assume that my statement about the garage is relevant to their being out of gas. So the only way for this to be relevant to their being out of gas is if you can get gasoline at this garage on the corner. What I want to do is apply some of these lessons about the logic of conversation back to our discussion about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. And my thought here is going to be that saying all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter is to violate the maxims of quantity and relevance from the logic of conversation. The maxims of quantity tell us that we are only supposed to give as much information as is required for the purposes of that conversation. And in particular, we should not give more information than is required. And the way that this particular maxim often works out is that we shouldn't say things in a conversation that we take to be completely obvious and we take our conversation partners to think is completely obvious. So it seems to me that all lives matter is completely and totally obvious to absolutely everybody. So because of this, the maxim of quantity would tell us that it's too much information to say all lives matter. Completely obvious, we don't need to bring it up. Just like in the middle of this conversation, it would be really, really bizarre for me to remind you all, oh, by the way, do you know that you're awake and you're in SUNY Potsdam and you're sitting down? These would be really, really bizarre things for me to say because this is just totally and completely obvious. In the same way, I think it's totally and completely obvious that all lives matter, so it communicates almost nothing to say that all lives matter. So that's one of the reasons I think that responding to somebody saying Black Lives Matter with all lives matter is to violate some of the maxims from the logic of conversation. But I also think that responding with all lives matter violates the maxim of relevance. So when somebody says that Black Lives Matter, there's a reason they've specified a particular group. This is supposed to be communicating that there is differential treatment between people of color and white people in our society. So the relevant purposes of the conversation when somebody says Black Lives Matter is to talk about differential treatment of different racial groups. So then to come back with a response of all lives matter, where we are no longer differentiating between racial groups in any way, shape, or form, is to completely and totally miss the relevant purposes of this conversation. So this is the sense in which I think responding with all lives matter violates the maxim of relevance. The relevant purposes of a conversation started with Black Lives Matter are to talk about unjust differential treatments between different racial groups. And to respond again with all lives matter is to completely ignore the purposes of this conversation. So far, I don't feel like I've said really anything different than sort of the snappy way I put things at the beginning here. So you might say, why in the world do we need to bring in this sort of technical machinery from the philosophy of language to make this point that we can already make in ordinary ways of talking about things? When we move from pointing out which maxims saying all lives matter violates to pointing out which maxims we have not said all lives matter violates. So I should give a little background before I go into that. When I have tried to have this conversation with people before and I've tried to say, you shouldn't say all lives matter, I've gotten a response of something like, well, does that mean you don't believe all lives matter? Do you think it's not true that all lives matter? And that is not in the slightest bit what I am saying here. Because notice, I have not said that the maxim of quality has been violated. I've said that the maxims of quantity and relevance have been violated. And it's the maxim of quality that talks about truth and falsity. I have not said that saying all lives matter violates the maxim of quality, and that means I have not said that it is untrue that all lives matter. What I've said is that it's basically missing the point of the conversation to say that all lives matter, and it's not to take your conversation partner seriously to say all lives matter. So this is the sense in which I think bringing in this machinery from Grice can actually be helpful for us. So I think it gives us a way to respond to the particular person who wants to say to us, well, if you're not willing to say all lives matter, that must mean you don't believe that all lives matter. And exactly what Grice's work shows here is that we can perfectly well believe that all lives matter and still think that it's completely and totally inappropriate to say all lives matter in response to somebody saying Black lives matter. So that's one of the ways in which I think this pretentious overthinking and over-explaining can actually be a little bit helpful for us. One of my big takeaways that I want to get out of this. So basically, what I've tried to claim here is that paying attention to idiosyncratic details of a particular context is unbelievably important in many, many conversations about race, racism, and race relations. What I've said here is if you are trying to think about the Black Lives Matter movement without paying attention to the particular facets of this conversational context, you're going to miss the point entirely. And I think this is relevant for what I claimed was my second goal earlier. So my second goal, again, was to try to give people reason to think that these sort of algorithms, these completely general rules that will sort of tell us how to be anti-racist in any context whatsoever, are not going to be forthcoming. Exactly what this sort of Gricean analysis of the Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter debate has shown is that if you want to understand some of these things, you need to be paying attention to particular facets of a context, so that completely general rules that you can just mindlessly follow regardless of which context you're in are not going to be helpful. A checklist, do's and don'ts, these things that will be sort of context-free, these are not going to be helpful in furthering our anti-racist goals. So, one way in which I think it's particularly important to pay attention to context is by paying attention to the conversational context. But I also think that when we turn to historical context, we get some further reasons to prefer Black Lives Matter over All Lives Matter. So another reason I've heard people say that they would prefer All Lives Matter is they've said something like, well, you know, I'm happy with the Black Lives Matter slogan, but All Lives Matter is more inclusive. And it's just a switch, a small switch in the slogan, so it's really not a big deal. We should err on the side of caution and go with All Lives Matter instead of Black Lives Matter. Now, I think this completely and totally misses the historical context of slogans for the civil rights movement. Slogans have been unbelievably important to the civil rights movement throughout its history. Things like, "We shall overcome," "Freedom now," "Black power," "Power to the people." These have been extremely important in rallying the civil rights movement, in organizing the civil rights movement, in pushing the civil rights movement forward. And for this reason, I think wanting to change a slogan associated with the civil rights movement needs to be taken extremely seriously. Especially if we think about the change from "Freedom now" as a slogan for the civil rights movement to "Black power" as a slogan for the civil rights movement. I want to read you a short little piece here from, so this is a book called Sisters in the Struggle, African American Women in the Civil Rights Black Power Movement. That this just talks a little bit about the context in which there was this change from freedom now as the rallying cry for the civil rights movement to black power as the cry for the civil rights movement. It says, in June 1966, James Meredith, the first black student ever to enroll at the University of Mississippi, began his historic march against fear across the state of Mississippi. Just a few days after the march began, Meredith was shot by a sniper and had to be hospitalized. The leaders of the major civil rights organizations, CORE, SNCC, SCLC, and the NAACP, all decided to send representatives to continue the march. As the marchers made their way across the state, they were greeted by enthusiastic crowds of black Mississippians who voiced their encouragement as the marchers passed. But mixed in with the shouts of encouragement was an undertone of frustration. Like so many others, black Mississippians had heard government promises of better conditions, yet it seemed that their lives had not changed. Most were tired of waiting, and they made their impatience known. Now, many members of SNCC who had been working for these changes mirrored the crowd's impatience and frustration. It was in that atmosphere that the cry of Black Power first surfaced. It all started when the marchers arrived in Greenwood on June 16th. Stokely Carmichael, SNCC's chairman, was arrested for attempting to defy a police order. Meanwhile, a crowd of well-wishers that had gathered to hear Carmichael speak became angry when they got word that he had been arrested. As they milled around in the hot June sunshine, many soon began to perspire, and their collective resentment grew as their level of discomfort rose. Why had local authorities arrested Carmichael, they demanded to know. After all, they reasoned, they were just trying to hold a peaceful assembly. It seemed that the white folks were determined to interfere with every aspect of their lives. And as the crowd became increasingly restless, Carmichael suddenly appeared after being bailed out of jail. A hush fell over the gathering as they waited expectantly, and Carmichael began speaking slowly and deliberately at first, but then his words came out faster and the level of his voice rose, building to a dramatic crescendo. In a clear, lifting voice that was heavy with emotion and just a hint of his Trinidadian accent, Carmichael told the waiting rally, "This is the 27th time I have been arrested. I ain't going to jail no more. What we're going to start saying now," he cried, "is Black Power." The crowd roared back, "Black Power." And standing there in the crowd that day was Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, a young black Atlantan who had just recently been elected to the post of executive secretary in SNCC. And as she raised her fist and shouted Black Power, Ruby could feel the excitement of the crowd all around her. She knew that this was an historic occasion, and she was sure that the civil rights struggle could never be the same again. But what did it all mean, Ruby wondered. Always the practical strategist, she worried about how this new slogan would be defined and what impact it would have on the civil rights struggle. So, this change here in slogans for the civil rights movement was taken on all sides to be an unbelievable change in what was going on with the civil rights movement and what the purposes of the civil rights movement were. If you were a fan of the Black Power, slogan, you took this as a change from you took this to be a change from asking for tolerance to asking for outright acceptance. This change from freedom now to Black Power was also a change from asking to not have your rights infringed upon to moving to being empowered to do whatever it is that white people are allowed to do in the society. If you were a proponent of the change from freedom now to Black Power, this signaled a move from asking about reform, making small changes to the way we do things, to asking for outright revolution and a change in the structures of American society. And bringing this all together, this change from freedom now to black power as a slogan for the civil rights movement was asking for black people to no longer be explaining themselves to white people and asking white people to give them what's rightfully theirs, but demanding this. And it's not just the fans of the change from freedom now to black power that took this to be a large, large change in the civil rights movement. If you were an opponent of this change, if you were a detractor of this change, you took this lack of passiveness as a sign from a shift from the nonviolent to the violent. And you took this focus on solidarity and black nationalism as the sign of the shift from integrationist aims to separatist aims. And finally, the attack on the fundamental values of ruling class America was a sign of the shift from the civil rights movement being pro-black to anti-white, if you were a detractor of this change from the freedom now to black power. Now, I'm not trying to weigh in on whether or not I think this was a good move from freedom now to black power as a slogan for the civil rights movement. What I'm trying to say here is that changing a slogan associated with the civil rights movement is a really, really big deal. So we should not be thinking along the lines of, oh, you know, it's just a small change from Black Lives Matter to All Lives Matter. So, you know, we should just err on the side of caution and go with All Lives Matter. This, again, I think completely and totally ignores the historical context of the importance of slogans and the importance of change of slogans for the civil rights movement. So this is another way in which I think we need to recognize that paying attention to idiosyncratic details of a particular context is key in many, many conversations about race, racism, and race relations. And again, I think this gives us further reason to not be looking for context-free checklists that are always going to tell us exactly what we need to do in order to be anti-racist. I think if white people are really, really committed to being anti-racist, what we need to do is start struggling and grappling with issues of race. We need to not just be hoping for a one-size-fits-all fix-it kit. We need to be willing to actually engage in these issues and figure out the ways in which we have been complicit in racist structures and the ways in which we can help undermine these racist structures. So these first thoughts here that I brought in dealing with Grice and the logic of conversation, these come from, like I said, my training as a philosopher of language. But these last thoughts I've brought up on the history of the civil rights movement and the importance of slogans to social movements, these thoughts came from some work I have been doing trying to learn things myself. And in large part, a number of these things I learned by sitting in on Heather Sullivan Catlin's social movements class last semester. And I bring this up because, again, my final goal for today was to try to convince you that there are ways for us to stick entirely within our own expertise and still be talking about really, really important social justice issues. So this is something that I have come up with some ways to do with my work in the philosophy of language. Heather Sullivan Catlin has come up with ways to do this in her work on social movements, and lots of other faculty on campus are figuring out ways to do this with their own expertise. And I would really, really encourage as many people as possible to be trying to do this in their own work lives. So I wanted to end here with reading you just a little bit of a piece I wrote as part of my work with POP. So I say here, regardless of one's opinions on the current status and the future of race and diversity issues in our society, I think most can agree that we need to get better at discussing these things. And given some of the events of the last year, an improved dialogue on diversity and inclusion on our own campus is particularly important. And it's also important to note that, as any quick glance at the 24-hour news stations will show, it isn't necessarily more conversation that's needed, but better, more sustained, more constructive conversation that is needed. And if our classrooms aren't a place for sustained, constructive dialogue on important issues of our day where growth is sorely needed, then I don't exactly know what service it is that we provide, especially in a publicly funded institution. So I wanted to spend today a short amount of time trying to convince you that you can and should think of your classroom as a place for welcoming discussion on racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, Islamophobia, ableism, and any of the other ugly manifestations of oppression that your discipline may be well suited to combat. And I hope for a future where many of my colleagues here at SUNY Potsdam see similar endeavors as part and parcel of their charge and calling. And as I hope to have made clear today, simply by researching and teaching cases like those I've talked about and bringing the relevant realities of social oppression into the course, we are able to open up the issues for discussion while still teaching very much within our own expertise. And I said, if you feel like you need a little bit of a kickstart, please join us in October for some workshops related to these matters. But now I'll say we've got some more workshops happening next week, April 14th and 15th. So if you feel like you still need a bit of a kickstart, please, please, please join us for these workshops next week, April 14th and 15th. Myself and Jennifer are the co-chairs of POP. If you have any questions, ask us. Lonell, Michael, Cheryl are also members of the steering committee for POP. I'm sure they would be willing to talk to you about some of these things as well. But that's all I've got, and I'd love to hear any thoughts you might have.